And our third speaker is Raghuram Rajan, the Eric Gleacher Distinguished Service Professor of Finance. He's a former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund and an honorary economic advisor to India's Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. He previously headed a committee appointed by the Planning Commission on Financial Reforms in India. He won the inaugural Fisher-Black Prize in 2003 for his contributions to the theory and practice of finance. And his most recent book, Fault Lines: How Hidden Fractures Still Threaten the World Economy, very recently won the Financial Times and the Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year Award for 2010.
It's always a problem coming last, especially after two brilliant speakers. So what I'm going to do is just echo some of the thoughts that they gave and then focus on a couple of topics that I think I want to push in greater detail. First, I agree very much that we are going to have a steady but not spectacular recovery in the United States. We'll probably have stronger growth in the emerging markets, especially the poorer emerging markets, where I think the dependence on industrial country growth is more limited. We may see new areas of growth across the world, places like Africa, based on exporting commodities to other emerging markets. I think that would be a new over the next few years. I do think that political risks are increasing, and much of the downside over the next few years, whether it's in Japan or in Europe or in the United States, will come from concerns about political risk, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And finally, I will argue along the lines, to some extent, that Eric has, that this crisis offers us an opportunity to think about whether the growth that we had earlier was sustainable, and whether, in fact, we should spend our time not thinking about stimulating our way back to the earlier ways of growth. And this is where I have a problem with Fed policy, but really whether we should be thinking about structuring new ways of growth, and whether we're doing enough on that in this country, not just in this country, but in other parts of the world. So that's, to some extent, where I'm going. I'll start with what I think is a point that Eric made, which I think is actually quite worrisome, which is the two-paced nature of the recovery, not just in the United States, but also in Europe. We have states that at this point didn't suffer much from the housing bust, that employment growth is starting to pick up, sales growth is picking up quite strongly. Colleagues of ours, Atif Mian and Amir Sufi, have some nice graphs on it, and I'm happy to share those with you. I have a presentation which I can make available. But this two-paced nature of growth is not just reflected geographically, but also across income segments. You find that upper income segments have a much better sense that growth is upon us. They're much more optimistic. Consumer confidence is high for those earning above $75,000. Below that, it's much worse. And you can see it also across the educated versus the uneducated. Unemployment rates for those with a college degree are half, as they've historically been, of those without a college degree, but those without a college degree are now suffering not just from very high unemployment rates, but also from the fact that some of these people were led to buy houses and are drowning in the debt that they took on, and so on. So it's not just geographic, but it's across income segments. And I think what this does is it causes a deterioration in the political dialogue. What we have is, in the United States, a left that doesn't want to talk to the right. And of course, this is a recipe for gridlock. Now, many of you have experienced previous periods of gridlock in Washington and say, well, that's okay. Government not working is not a bad thing. At least the private sector is allowed to go its own way. The problem, of course, is the government not working when your fiscal deficit is 10% of GDP is not a good idea, because there's a lot you need to do to bring things back under control, and that does require cooperation from both sides of the aisle. It will imply both expenditure reduction as well as tax increases, and unfortunately the climate in Washington is not good for that. So we can talk more about the fiscal problems when we have our discussion. But I also wanted to highlight there are some silver linings in the picture for the United States. One, of course, is the tremendously strong health of large corporations. Not so much the small and medium-sized corporations, many of them dependent on credit from small and medium-sized banks which have problems of their own. But the large corporations have been able to emerge from this crisis in a very strong position, partly because their reaction to the crisis was swift. Many of them cut employment very quickly, and the initial flush of productivity growth in large corporations was because they were making do with fewer workers with the same amount of capital that they had before, more capital deepening per employee. Labor productivity was very high. Since then, they've started investing, as Randy said, perhaps not as strongly so far as in recoveries from previous recessions, but also they focused a lot on what we call improving total factor productivity growth, that is, improving the way people work with capital, and as a result, profitability in U.S. corporations has been very, very strong over the last few quarters. Now, of course, that doesn't matter as much for the politician when he looks at 9.5% unemployment and he wonders where employment growth is going to come from. And I think here Eric made a very, very important point that a significant part of this unemployment may be structural. And we can stimulate all we want, but we're not going to buy houses in the same way as we used to buy before. So even if demand comes back in a stronger way, it's not going to be focused on the same goods which the people were making earlier. And as a result, policy is going to be less effective. What is worrisome, however, is that we're not spending enough time thinking about the structural nature of the unemployment. A lot of the debate in Washington is still about expanding demand as opposed to trying to work with supply. And I wish I had your graphs. I was having a little debate with Paul Krugman where he insisted it was all a matter of demand, not structural. And we'll again talk about what effect monetary policy has. I'm entirely with Randy when he says that the Fed did a heroic job in the panic of 2008. I think what Ben Bernanke and colleagues like Randy did over that time really, they should be put on a pedestal, and we should all bow to them for bringing the economy out of what could have been a Great Depression Mark II. You don't have to agree with every decision they made then, but it was all made at a time of tremendous pressure, and I think by and large they have to get an A+ grade for what they did. Now, going forward, however, you can depart from what the Fed is doing, especially because Randy's not there any longer. But the notion that in some way we need the Fed to stimulate the economy back to action and that it has no side effects, I think is very worrisome. And my worries about quantitative easing too are precisely focused on that, and I'll maybe come to that in our discussion. So I think for the U.S., the worry is not about the corporate sector. It's not about the large banks. There are worries about the small and medium-sized banks. They will need more capital, and unfortunately, many of them are not raising that right now. That will be a constraint on the growth of small and medium-sized firms. That's something to worry about. But the biggest worry in the U.S. has to be political. What happens on the fiscal side? Are we able to get the government's finances back in order? And if they don't, which is by far the central prognosis right now, at what point do the bond markets start worrying about financing the U.S.? Certainly the municipal bond markets have started worrying about state finances. And of course, there could be domino effects if the federal government has to come to the rescue of some states. But I think the federal government still has a lot of capacity, provided there's a sense that politics in Washington will come to its senses. I don't think at this point we can predict confidently that will happen. Europe is an interesting example of what happens when the politics breaks down. In Europe, we have, again, a two-paced recovery. We have a very, very strong Germany, which recovered on the basis of exports, which it has been strong at. But increasingly, you see domestic demand in Germany picking up. And Germany is actually a very interesting country to think about, because in many ways, Germany made a lot of mistakes 20 years ago. One of the things it did was it reunified with East Germany at what may have been the wrong exchange rate. They paid too much for East German assets. They paid too much for East German workers. And as they reunified, putting too high a value on the East German mark, they found much of East Germany was unproductive at those prices. And so there's tremendous unemployment in East Germany, but now they were a unified country. And so this high levels of unemployment in East Germany started working to restrain wage growth in West Germany. Unions started making concessions. Unions stopped feather bedding. There was a lot of decline. If you look at Germany's labor share of GDP, how much workers earn of GDP, that declined steadily from about the 1980s, and only now has started coming back up. Now, what this means is over this period, Germany became very competitive. German workers became, because of wage restraints, because of changes in employment structures and so on, to the point that Germany has become an export powerhouse now, a powerhouse that can export to China and still make money doing that. And it is also a country now where workers feel confident about the future. Workers, having held their wages down, now have very low levels of unemployment, 6 or 7% at this point, and now see going forward that wage growth will be reasonable. German demand is picking up. And in a sense, Germany has spent the last 15 or 20 years doing penance for having a bloated economy, and have now come out with an economy which is like one of those supercars that Daimler or Audi makes. Unfortunately, much of Europe has not kept pace, and this is where the tensions come, because Germany is coasting ahead, Netherlands is tagging along, Austria is tagging along, the Scandinavian countries are doing quite well. In the meantime, France is sort of staggering a little bit, but it's still not down. And the southern Mediterranean countries are down on are flat on their backs, Spain, Portugal, Greece. And of course, the Germans are saying, we took the pain. We took the pain over the 15 years and became competitive. You guys, you're the grasshoppers who celebrated spending because you were part of the euro area and you had no worries about issuing debt. And now you expect us, Germany, to pick up the bill. The amount of anxiety in Germany about having to foot Europe's bills going forward is tremendous, which is why Angela Merkel, a few weeks back, said bondholders have to accept some of the pain. Don't expect us to foot every bondholder's bill going forward, and that started, again, the second crisis in Europe. Now, it's hard to predict what will happen. I don't think there's any chance the euro as a concept will fall apart. I think the original concept was to make sure of the whole idea of European integration was to make sure that Germany and France would never fight a war again. And I think that concept still holds. I think the idea of tying these countries together will persist. These countries are close enough in the kinds of economies they have that a common currency is sensible, and they will be joined by countries like Netherlands, Austria, Benelux, and so on. The question could be asked about whether if a country like Greece has to restructure, which seems highly likely, at some point it might think about whether it sort of suffers more from the euro than it gets. Right now, they're not asking those questions. I was in Spain 3 weeks ago, and in Spain they say very much that, yes, the euro is painful, yes, the monetary policy in the euro is attuned to Germany's growth rather than to our current depression, but nevertheless, we'll stick to it because the benefits far outweigh the costs. And going forward, it will bring discipline to our policies, and we want that discipline. How long they will stay with that is anybody's guess. And I think Randy asked the right question. If Spain falls, what does Europe do? And I think none of us can really say at this point what it will do. The hope is that Spain will muddle through, and Spain will not require a large bailout. Spain, unlike Ireland, the problem is not with the large Spanish banks. The problem in Spain is with the government deficit and whether it can actually tighten that enough to assure the markets. Now, so Europe is struggling with its problems. Again, much of them are political in nature, stemming from the recession of 2008. Finally, turning to the emerging markets. That's actually, for the moment, a very, very bright spot. You see, for the first time, emerging markets have survived an industrial country crisis. And so countries in Latin America are growing strongly, a number of very strong growers in Africa. One of the bright spots in Africa is the level of conflicts has come down. When I was at the IMF, we invariably got our forecasts on Africa wrong because every year, one or two countries would get into conflict and GDP would fall by 25%. So the averages were totally off every year. For the first time, you're seeing the level of conflict in Africa going down and a number of countries growing quite strongly, some on the basis of commodity resources, but others on the basis of just their natural abilities. Egypt is a country without much in the way of natural resources, but could be one of the BRIC hanger-ons at some point. Finally, I mean, no discussion of the world economy is complete without talking about China. I think China is one of the few countries which still makes plans, 5-year plans. And what is interesting is China seems to have understood the fundamental problem with the economy as embodied in what they plan to do in the next 5-year plan. People argue that in 1998, the lesson that China took from the Asian crisis was never be dependent on foreign capital for growth. And they weren't. They started focusing on exports. They generated their own capital. In 2008, the lesson they took away, according to my Chinese friends, is never be dependent on other countries for demand. Generate your own demand. So the plan, the Chinese plan, is to move away from dependency on the industrial countries to generate their own demand. And this means not just the exchange rate. Too much focus is put on the Chinese exchange rate. The real problem in China is it's got an excessively producer-focused economy, with corporations getting subsidies in the form of low interest rates, cheap access to natural resources, wages that are restricted. And essentially, China's problem is not so much that households save too much, it is that too much of the profits in the economy go to corporations, which save too much. And China would be rebalanced much better if income moved from the corporations to the households, which means increases in wages, which means a fair price for natural resources, which means increases in interest rates, higher rates paid to depositors, and higher taxes on corporations with more spending on households. This is what China needs to do. It's a whole strategic change. It is much bigger than allowing the renminbi to appreciate, but that's part of the overall, that should be the overall goal. And China's embarked on this much slower than meets the eye here, but it is happening. And my sense is in the next 5 to 10 years, the bright spots in the world economy will be countries like Germany, countries like China will become engines of world demand and help propel us, even while the world as a whole, I think, becomes more balanced in the sense that emerging markets, where the poorer people of the world live, will account for much bigger demand in the world. And we'll talk about some examples from that if we get the time in the discussion.
Great.